kill him!
There's a rumor that's followed her for over a century, that she took young men to her bed at night, and by morning, they were dead, silenced forever, so her secret would never leave the palace walls. Nobody has ever proven that story, but by the end of this video, you'll know exactly where it came from, who invented it, and why it stuck for over 100 years. Because one thing isn't a rumor. She let her own son rot from a disease she could have stopped, because keeping her grip on power mattered more than saving him. She cared more about throwing herself a birthday party than she did about the warships that were supposed to be defending her country. This is the woman history remembers as the Empress who dragged an empire toward collapse. Her name was Cixi, and before you decide she was simply a monster, you should know how a minor official's daughter clawed her way from the bottom of an imperial harem to become the single most powerful person in China, and stayed there for almost 50 years. Her real name was Yehanara Xingzhen, though almost no one alive was allowed to say it. She was born in Beijing in 1835, the daughter of a low-ranking Manchu official named Huijing. Her father spent his career shuffled between provincial postings, which meant young Cixi grew up watching the machinery of bureaucracy up close. Who to flatter, who to avoid, how power actually moved through a room. What she didn't get was a real education. Manchu girls of her era weren't taught to read or write Manchu, the language of the ruling class. Instead, she learned classical Chinese well enough to read and write, and she picked up the accomplishments expected of a well-bred young woman. Embroidery, music, the kind of polish that made a girl marriageable, not powerful. At 16, that polish caught someone's attention. She was selected as a candidate for the imperial harem, and at 17, she officially entered the court of the Xianfeng emperor. Getting into the palace didn't mean getting anywhere near power. The imperial harem ran on a strict hierarchy, and Cixi entered near the bottom, a 6th-rank concubine, one face among hundreds competing for a single man's attention. So she competed. She reportedly bribed eunuchs to whisper her name to the emperor, and made sure she was always somewhere along his usual paths through the palace. The beauty routines bordered on obsessive. Accounts describe her using pearl powder on her skin and grinding pearls to consume, chasing the porcelain complexion prized at court. Other accounts claim wet nurses were brought in so she could drink fresh breast milk daily, believed to preserve youth. How much of this is documented fact versus palace legend is genuinely disputed, but the ambition behind it wasn't. And still, it barely worked. Worse, she made the mistake of offering the emperor political opinions, something strictly forbidden for a concubine. Xianfeng reportedly rebuked her to her face, calling her arrogant and scheming. Meanwhile, another concubine who entered the palace around the same time as Cixi, a woman named Jen, rose from 5th rank to Empress in just 4 months. That woman would become Empress Tian, and for years, Cixi would watch her with something between admiration and envy. Battered by criticism but not deterred, Cixi kept pursuing the emperor's attention. Eventually, her singing voice won her a night with him, and she was elevated to the rank of noble lady. Then, in 1856, everything changed. Cixi gave birth to a son, Zaichun, the future Tongzhi emperor. For a ruler desperate for an heir, this was everything. Xianfeng was overjoyed and elevated her again, this time to consort, just below Empress herself. But the timing was brutal. China was being torn apart by the Second Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion, and a string of child emperors loomed on the horizon. Cixi, sensing that her real path to power ran through the emperor's favor rather than motherhood, poured her energy into keeping Xianfeng close, reportedly to the point of neglecting her own son's upbringing. Ambition, it seems, outweighed instinct. In 1860, British and French forces stormed Beijing during the Second Opium War, and the imperial family fled to safety. Xianfeng's half-brother, Prince Gong, negotiated the Convention of Peking, paying a massive indemnity and ceding territory to end the crisis. But the humiliation didn't stop there. When Russia seized more territory soon after, the shock reportedly broke Xianfeng's health entirely. He died in 1861, only 31 years old. This is where Cixi's real rise begins. With no other sons between Xianfeng and Qian, Cixi's 5-year-old boy became Emperor, the Tongzhi Emperor, and Cixi, now Empress Dowager, moved to secure her position as co-regent alongside Qian. But a council of regents appointed before Xianfeng's death stood in her way. So, Cixi struck. In what's remembered as the Xinyu Coup, she moved decisively against the regents who opposed her, purging them from power, with Prince Gong's crucial support. It worked. Cixi and Qian began ruling from behind the curtain, officially deferring to the young emperor while actually controlling the empire themselves. With real power finally in hand, Cixi turned her attention to the crisis facing China, a country being outpaced by industrialized foreign powers and eaten away from within. She backed reform-minded officials like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongjiang, and threw her support behind the self-strengthening movement, an effort to import Western military technology and modernize China's defenses without abandoning its traditional political structure. Officially, her regency was supposed to end once Tongzhi came of age in 1873. In practice, Cixi found every excuse to keep her hands on the levers of state, and her relationship with her own son had curdled. Tongzhi was closer to the gentler Qian than to his strict, controlling birth mother, and Cixi knew it and resented it. When Tongzhi turned 15, both women proposed brides for him. He chose Qian's pick, a woman named Alute, over Cixi's, and Cixi's jealousy hardened into open interference. She reportedly restricted how often the young emperor could even visit his own wife's chambers, citing his studies. Frustrated and isolated, Tongzhi allegedly sought comfort elsewhere, in Beijing's brothels. Whether or not that's precisely what happened, the emperor's health collapsed rapidly, and he died in 1874 at just 19. The official record lists smallpox as the cause. Rumors of the time, never confirmed, whispered of something else entirely. The court was thrown into chaos. Tongzhi had no heir, though his pregnant widow, Alute, still carried a chance at one. If she gave birth to a boy, the succession crisis would resolve itself. Cixi didn't wait to find out. She mobilized military backing and overrode centuries of succession tradition, adopting a 4-year-old boy, the son of her own sister and Xianfeng's brother, and installing him as the new emperor. This was Guangxu. He was 4 years old, and once again, the emperor is too young to rule, became Cixi's justification for staying in power. Cixi's position as sole ruler still wasn't complete. Xian was technically her equal in the regency, and Cixi's ambition didn't tolerate rivals for long. In 1881, Xian died suddenly, officially, of a stroke. A persistent rumor claims Cixi sent her a poisoned cake. It's never been proven, but given everything else Cixi is documented to have done to consolidate power, it's a rumor historians haven't been able to fully dismiss either. With Qian gone, Cixi moved against the last major check on her authority, Prince Gong, the man who'd once helped her seize power in the first place. He was purged. The government of China now answered to one person. Guangxu grew up almost entirely under Cixi's supervision. She reportedly sat in on his lessons and quizzed him afterward, maintaining tight control disguised as maternal devotion. When he turned 19 and wanted to choose his own bride, Cixi overruled him and installed her own niece as Empress instead, even hand-selecting his concubines. Around this time, Cixi formally retired to the summer palace, the Yiheyuan. On paper, she'd stepped back. In practice, she never stopped watching and never stopped intervening. In 1895, disaster struck. China suffered a humiliating defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, and the self-strengthening movement Cixi had championed for decades collapsed with it. It's tempting, and historians have long debated, how much of that defeat traces back to Cixi personally. What's well documented is her focus during the crisis, throwing herself into planning her 60th birthday celebration, a party that reportedly cost an almost unbelievable 10 million taels of silver while the war raged on. She also poured enormous sums into rebuilding the summer palace, an estimated 30 million taels. For years, popular history blamed this spending directly for crippling the Chinese Navy's budget. More recent research complicates that story. Some historians argue the palace funds and naval funds were more separate than the legend suggests, and that the Navy's real failure came from years of neglect after Cixi's retirement, when Guangxu himself lost interest in maintaining it. Either way, the optics were catastrophic a lavish palace rising while a war was being lost, and the war was lost badly. Chinese forces reportedly went into battle with poorly maintained ships, inadequate ammunition. Some accounts claim gunpowder was even cut with beans to save money, and troops that hadn't trained properly in years. The result was a rout. China was forced into the Treaty of Shimonoseki, a massive indemnity, the loss of Taiwan, and yet another blow to imperial prestige. Guangxu, humiliated and desperate to escape Cixi's shadow, allied with reformist thinkers Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao. In the summer of 1898, he launched the 100 Days Reform, a sweeping attempt to modernize China's government, military and economy almost overnight. Cixi wasn't going to let that stand. Working with conservative officials, including Yuan Shikai, she staged a counter-coup. The reforms collapsed after just over 100 days. Guangxu was placed under effective house arrest for the rest of his life, and Cixi announced, falsely, that he was simply ill. The key reformers who couldn't escape were executed. Emboldened, Cixi threw her support behind the Boxer Rebellion, a violent anti-foreign uprising, and in 1900 declared war on 8 foreign powers simultaneously. It went about as well as you'd expect. Allied forces crushed the Boxers, stormed Beijing, and burned the old Summer Palace grounds for a second time in the empire's history. Cixi and Guangxu fled the capital disguised as ordinary peasants, reportedly going 2 days without proper food or water. From exile, she instructed the officials left behind to accept almost any foreign demand, as long as her own position was protected. The result was the Boxer Protocol of 1901. Another crushing indemnity, and the right for foreign troops to be permanently stationed in Beijing. Something shifted after that. Back in Beijing, Cixi, whether out of genuine reflection or sheer political survival instinct, reversed course. She began hosting the wives of foreign diplomats, softened her image, and launched the new policies reforms explicitly modeled on the Western systems she'd resisted for decades. But the extravagance never really stopped. Meals reportedly featured up to 128 dishes at a sitting, at a cost historians estimate could have fed thousands of peasant families for a day. She was famously particular, refusing to eat the same dish twice in one sitting, and her wardrobe alone was said to fill thousands of storage chests, changed multiple times a day. The fear she inspired was just as extreme. Attendants reportedly lived in terror of her temper. Even losing a single strand of hair while combing it could cost a servant their life, leading maids to develop tricks with wide sleeves just to hide loose strands from her sight. This is the version of Cixi most people know. Vain, paranoid, drenched in luxury while her country burned. And it's also exactly the kind of reputation that made a rumor like she killed 3,000 men easy to believe. So let's actually answer the question this video opened with: where did that story come from? The claim shows up almost nowhere in Chinese court records, contemporary Chinese sources, or serious modern biographies. Instead, it traces back to one man, a British writer named Edmund Backhouse. In 1910, 2 years after Cixi's death, Backhouse co-wrote a best-selling biography called China Under the Empress Dowager, packed with intimate, scandalous details about her private life, supposedly drawn from a secret diary and inside palace sources. It was treated as serious scholarship for decades. Then, historians going back through his research discovered something damning. Backhouse had fabricated many of his sources. Entire documents he cited didn't exist. He was, by most modern accounts, a con man and a forger who spun increasingly lurid tales. Some biographers believe he even claimed in a separate memoir to have been Cixi's secret lover himself, decades after she was old enough to be his grandmother. But Backhouse didn't invent the hostility out of nowhere. He was writing for an audience already primed to believe the worst. After Cixi crushed the 100 Days Reform in 1898, the reformers she'd exiled or executed, men like Kang Yuwei, spent years afterward, from exile, feeding foreign journalists and writers every horror story they could about the woman who destroyed their movement and their careers. And once the Qing dynasty finally collapsed in 1911, it was simply more convenient for the revolutionaries who came after to blame the empire's fall on one corrupt, power-hungry woman than to reckon with centuries of decline under a long line of male emperors before her. So here's the honest answer. there's no credible evidence Cixi actually killed 3,000 men after sleeping with them. It's a story with a traceable origin, a discredited forger, a circle of embittered political enemies, and a new republic that needed someone to blame. But it's also not a rumor that came from nowhere. Cixi really did have rivals who died conveniently. She really did poison, or was at least widely believed to have poisoned, people who stood between her and the throne. She built a court so secretive and so lethal to anyone who crossed her that when the wildest possible story about her showed up, almost nobody found it hard to believe. By her final years, Cixi's health was failing. She'd suffered from chronic digestive problems for years, worsened by her diet and the near-constant banqueting. In November 1908, at 73, she knew she was dying. And even then, she wasn't finished consolidating power. Guangxu, still under house arrest, died on November 14th, one day before Cixi. For decades, that was treated as historical coincidence. Then, in 2008, forensic testing on his remains found lethal levels of arsenic in his hair. Modern science essentially confirmed what court gossip had whispered for a century. Cixi likely ensured her nephew wouldn't outlive her. With the throne empty, her final act was choosing a successor, her 2-year-old great-nephew, Puyi, and in a final, almost unbelievable twist, her deathbed instructions reportedly included an order that no woman should ever again be permitted to hold power like she had. She died the day after Guangxu. Puyi would go down in history as the last emperor of China, the dynasty collapsing entirely within 3 years of Cixi's death. Historians still can't fully agree on who she really was. To some, she's the woman who dragged a crumbling empire toward modernization against impossible odds. To others, she's the Empress whose thirst for control helped bring the whole thing down. What's certain is this: a minor official's daughter, once invisible at the bottom of an imperial harem, ended up controlling the fate of 400 million people for nearly half a century. And left behind a legacy so tangled in rumor and fact that more than 100 years later, we're still trying to sort out where the woman ends and the legend begins.